Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Hoyer. He currently holds a postdoctoral position working with Dr. Peter Turchin on the deep roots of the modern world, part of the SESHAT Global History Databank Project, a large-scale interdisciplinary and comparative project hosted by the Evolution Institute and the University of Oxford. And today we're going to focus on his book, together with Dr. Peter Turchin, Figuring Out the Past, the 3,495 vital statistics that explain world history. So, Dr. Hoyer, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. So, it's interesting the kind of data you present in the book. Is it one of its goals to try to perhaps go behind some of the limitations of how history is traditionally done?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I wouldn't describe it as limitations so much. I would say that, traditionally history has focused on deep qualitative dives into a very small set of historical cases or historical societies. And what we're trying to do with SESHAT generally, and I think what the book is really trying to get at is, there's a lot of interesting things that you can learn only when you sort of take that step back and take the macro level view and start to do some comparative history and say, okay, how similar actually were these societies? What are some common patterns that we can develop? And what we're trying to do in the book, sort of these vital statistics, are some of these actual patterns. So I try not to say that it's so much a limitation with historical work, more that, being disciplinarily, I think the willingness to engage with bigger questions, to engage with larger data sets, that's really what we're trying to do with the SESHAT project, with Clear Dynamics, and sort of our overall work.
But do you think that even in terms of understanding particular historical events, that with this kind of data we could do a better job than, for example, narrative history? Narrative in the sense that people try to provide a narrative of the events and try to explain how several different figures participated in them and this and that. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. It is something we think about a lot, we talk about a lot. We're obviously engaged with a lot of sort of more traditional historical historians and anthropologists. I would say not so much better. I don't think we do a better job. We do a different job. And to me, it's not so much, choosing one or the other, that sort of deep narrative qualitative dive that you're talking about, or the kind of macro level quantitative stuff that I, mostly focus on. It's really, combining these two methods, because both can inform each other. And really, the sort of suite of methods that you bring to bear totally depends on the kind of question you want to ask. If you want to ask about a very, narrow, specific single society, then narrative qualitative history is very appropriate. But if you want to ask questions about, general patterns in human history, if you especially want to look at causal forces and bringing out sort of what is the main drivers of these historical events, rather than just sort of understanding the details of the event itself, then I do think you need to bring at least a little bit of this sort of quantitative method. And so it's really a matter of, what is your question? What exactly are you trying to get out of? And then you can combine methods in interesting ways.
But in trying to understand these main drivers of history, let's say, of particular events or periods of time, I mean, there are several different approaches out there in history. There are people that focus on particular figures. There are other people that talk about the ideas and particular cultural phenomenon that were part of that particular society in that particular period of time. Then there are people that focus more on, let's say, for example, the material, the ecological conditions, and so on. So, I mean, do you go along with any of these views or not?
Yeah, I mean, this is really I think the crucial question. And to me, again, it's not so much, which one's right or which one has the most utility in answering these questions. It kind of depends on the question itself. And what I always sort of comes back to for me is a question of scale. And so at a very micro level scale, yes, these kinds of big men or sort of great thinker type histories. I mean, it's not my favorite way of doing history, but there is something there. I mean, there are individuals who have prominent effects. Think about some of my work on the Axial Age. I recently published a book on the Axial Age. That's one of the sort of great traditions in that line of scholarship, is focusing on these individual scholars like Confucius or Zarathustra and some, the big men type of analysis. And yes, they certainly had an important role to play. They were very, some of these ideas, if they were in fact true historical figures, they did have a prominent role. They did have an effect, but you can't explain the entire global set of patterns by focusing just on them or just on their works. They can't explain why you see, similar developments, similar axial type developments in Egypt, 1,000 years before Confucius was even born. So for that to actually explain the full range, then you need what you're talking about. You need to get into some of the material evidence, and you need to start to get comparative. And once you start to get comparative, once you have a large enough data set, it's really impossible for a single human to sort of narratively try to understand the patterns. That's where you really need quantitative methods. It's really the only approach that can allow you to sort of pick out the signal from the noise, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, but even these figures, and particularly the more intellectual ones, isn't it the case that in order to understand where their ideas come from or where their the ideological system that they developed came from, don't we also have to understand these sort of patterns you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very much my perspective, and I agree with that. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to just understand these great thinkers themselves or some of these philosophical or religious movements. They're very important. Like these narrative, qualitative histories are very, very useful in pumping our intuitions and just like understanding and building that set of empirical data. But I very much agree with you. I think that once you start getting into the issue of causality, once you start getting into the issue of, oh yeah, well, these figures arose, great. But why? Why is it that they arose precisely where and when they did? What were the incentive structures? What was the kind of social systems that were driving their ideas, not only to be formed, but then to be adopted, which is the other part. It's one thing to have, this great thinker who has a great idea, but it really only shows up in the historical record if it has a societal impact. And there, I totally agree with you. Then we're talking about the sort of larger scale societal dynamics that requires that bigger view.
Mm-hmm. And also because, to understand where their ideas come from, sometimes we also have to look at how their society is operated, right? Because, sometimes it's not the case that they are coming up with something particularly original, but they are observing what's happening in their societies in a particular period of time, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is really what comes out, again, in our work with the Axial Age, and our work with looking at different sort of religious dynamics and the dynamics of cultural systems. One of the things we find, a bit surprisingly, I think, to many people, is that, there really are a lot of common patterns. And it's not just that, there's some great individual like Confucius or like Plato who has this, great idea about moral philosophy. You see similar kinds of ideas about moral philosophy showing up all over the place in different parts of the world at different times. And that's this sort of commonality that seems to be this, repeated pattern in human history. So then you start to ask, well, why? What is actually prompting these things to happen? Old Kingdom Egypt has nothing to do with spring-autumn period China. Like they weren't involved. They were thousands of years apart. Yet you see a lot of very similar development. So how do you actually explain that? And this is where we get into, there's a lot of underlying dynamics that are going on. There's the sort of external pressures. There's the sort of competitive field that these states are involved in. They are scaling up. They're developing populations. They're developing new types of institutions to sort of manage these larger populations. And along with that, what we see, and this is sort of what's come out of our work, is that you also need cultural systems that can sort of keep the whole thing running, the sort of social glue, as we like to call it. And this is why we think you see certain kinds of moralizing religion sprout up only after you see sort of scaling up of different societies, why you see these kinds of philosophies about universality, about egalitarianism, these kind of axial modern type ideas. Well, they do arise in very particular places for very particular reasons. Like that seems to be, a useful component in maintaining cohesion at scale, is what the pattern seems to be showing.
And that includes the way that societies are organized, right? Because, for example, until the 15th, 16th century, when conquistadors arrived in the Americas, I mean, we can see across the globe different societies popping up in different places that, I mean, they follow certain kinds of trends that are similar across them, and even societies that were more or less isolated from one another, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, entirely isolated from one another. This is, the surprising thing. Again, to me, it's a matter of scale and sort of the level of your analysis. And it's not as though, oh, these societies are entirely similar or these societies are entirely unique. Both are true. And that's what's really interesting and sort of need to keep that in mind. Earlier work, we sort of showed, again, a little bit surprising to us was that, when you look about how are we going to characterize what we call social complexity, like how it is that societies are structured, how do they grow, what happens when they fall. It turns out that there's really just a single sort of dimension, a single package of features that are common throughout history, throughout the globe, as you say, in East Asia, in Northern Europe, in Africa, in South America, anywhere at any period of time. There seems to be this sort of single common set of factors that characterize what it means to be a growing complex society. But at the same time, yes, there's this kind of uniformity or similarity. But if you zoom in at any particular society, the way that these structures manifest is very different. And so, the kinds of religious systems that you find among the among the Aztecs or among, the Incas in South America are very different in their particulars and the kinds of deities and the kinds of literature that they have than you find in, say, Cambodia. But they're doing very similar things. And so to me, it's not sort of either or, it's usually and, if you see what I mean.
Right. But do you think we can talk about human universals in terms of the way of the features of each particular society and the ways they organize themselves and perhaps some of the institutions they develop? Because it seems that at least some of them are pretty similar.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's a very good question. It's tough to answer. Universals, I mean, it has such a terrible history. We don't like to talk about universal laws as though they're set in stone. But at the same time, I think you're right. Like, we can't shy away from the fact that empirically, when you do these sort of analyses, when you take this broad view, yeah, you're finding very similar patterns. To me, the way that I sort of approach it is the universals, like what sort of unites us and what is the same all over the globe throughout history, have really been the kinds of challenges that human societies face. The challenge of, maintaining cohesion, the challenge of solving collective action problems at scale, the challenge of, keeping your society kind of intact and functioning while maybe trying to institutionalize inequalities or while trying to defend yourself against scary neighbors. These are the kinds of challenges that really all societies are facing. And, there's not a single way to answer those problems, but there's also not an infinite number of choices. And so this is what we seem to find is that, the way that you, for example, maintain or the way that you solve collective action problems at increasing scale, there's only a very small set of sort of solutions that humans seem capable of producing to do that. It's not always the same, but it's pretty similar. And this is where we get at these kinds of institutionalized kind of hierarchies to keep everything sort of in order. This is why we see similar sorts of religious and ritual systems developing all over the world. Seems explained by the fact that, well, all these different societies are, finding similar ways to solve the same kinds of challenges.
But I mean, that happens. We see those patterns when societies try to scale up, but do we also see patterns across small scale societies? I mean, I'm not sure how far back the SESHAT goes.
Yeah.
The SESHAT go in terms of the kinds of societies it's interested in, but do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic point, and I'm glad you raised this. It helps to clarify this. So SESHAT goes back really as far as we can, and depends on the evidence that's available. Depends on the archaeological and anthropological work that's been done in different parts of the world. We go back as far as the Neolithic. We actually are working right now to expand our set of cases of late Pleistocene, Neolithic, early hunter-gatherer type semi-nomadic peoples. We're trying to get sort of even farther back in a more robust data set of that. And this is exactly, it's still a little bit of an open question, but this is work we're engaged in. And it seems to be, as you're suggesting, that it's not just that, okay, after a certain, threshold, when a society gets a particular amount of territory or a particular amount of population, then all these things kick in. The same trends are happening from the very beginning, right? From small tribal bands of a few dozen, maybe 100 or so people. It's still the same challenges. The solutions may be a little bit different, right? So, for example, we do a lot of work with my colleague Harvey Whitehouse about you find very different kinds of rituals, very different kinds of cultural systems are required to keep cohesion among, a small group of people, like 150 or so, then are required to keep cohesion amongst, a society that has millions of people. So the specific rituals are very different. It's, the difference between, a kind of scarification ritual or, taking all the men in a village will go out on hunt a dangerous animal together, and that's, life-threatening and it's scary, versus in sort of large, modern developed societies, the kinds of rituals we see aren't so scary, they're not so emotionally tense, they're more kind of rote, right? It's going to church every Sunday, it's sort of doing something, praying every day, whatever. But the sort of main point is that the effect of these, that the real driving force behind why these cultural systems seem to develop and why they seem to be so prominent is the same. It's trying to maintain cohesion. It's trying to sort of keep whatever size of group you have, trying to keep it intact. And that happens, throughout time, as far back as, 10,000 years ago, even further, we think. And it happens no matter what size of group you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Can we also get new insights through your database about cultural evolution? I mean, how culture evolves over time in different dimensions, perhaps, because I'm not sure if culture would evolve the same across different, for example, institutions, or, for example, if it occurs the same for ideas and tools and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that's one of the main reasons that SESHAT was sort of founded in 2014 was to, compile as much evidence as we can, precisely in order to answer questions about cultural evolution, to sort of test these theories out. There's a really interesting question about, does a cultural system evolve differently than, say, a material technology? Like, does religion and, iron tools evolve differently? Not so much. I would say less than many people think. I think that really what we are finding, and we've done a lot of work, both looking at sort of how cultural forms evolve, but also how, military technologies, how sort of agricultural technologies and productivity evolves as well. And what we find is that, again, there's differences in the sort of specific packages that different societies adopt, but a lot of similarities in terms of, the pressures, the sort of selective pressures from an evolutionary standpoint of what are driving all of these different things. And so a lot of it has to do with, as cultural evolution theories would expect, competition between groups, that sort of fierce rivalry, that really kind of existential threat that, your neighbor, your sort of, you get into a war with your neighbors, or you're in this sort of competitive network. And then it's sort of incumbent upon you to scale up, to develop technologies that will allow you to produce more people, produce more things, produce scarier weapons, produce better defenses. And so this is why we see things like cavalry and iron technology sort of develop in particular places where there's very high levels of intergroup conflict and then spread as that conflict spreads as well. So you get that kind of technological aspect. And of course, iron is not only a military weapon, it's also an agricultural weapon. So that increases your population because you're increasing your productivity, which then expands the scope of competitive pressure because you're now a larger, scarier state. But at the same time, that same pressure, that same kind of intergroup competition that's driving these technological advances is also then advancing and driving the cultural systems, right? So again, we talk about these cultural systems, a lot of these institutions, a lot of these norms. What they seem to be doing is trying to promote and maintain cooperation at scale. And that cooperation is, again, there's a selective pressure on it because the largest group that can cooperate the most tends to win in these conflicts. And so it's not just, getting scarier, bigger, more badder weaponry and this sort of technology, but it's also the ability to develop these cultural systems that can allow these now growing larger populations to still cooperate against their neighbor, to cooperate in warfare, to cooperate in whatever needs to happen to maintain that social stability. So that's why you see this sort of intense competition. You tend to then see a rise in technologies, and then you tend to see as well, in similar reasons, the development of these kinds of moralizing religions or institutions that facilitate cooperation at scale. And so it's very much, tied together as part of the same sort of patterns, which is really interesting find.
Yeah, we'll come back to religion later in the interview. Yeah. But are you also interested in understanding rates of innovation and the factors that play a role in them?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're currently involved in some work. I just led a paper that hopefully will be published soon about the development and sort of rates and the causes of military technology in particular, and why and how that spreads throughout time. We've looked at agricultural technology. Rates of change is an interesting topic. It's sort of, it depends. A lot of it depends on what exactly you're measuring. Is it any particular technology that you can think of, and sort of how quickly are these being either invented or adapted? Yes, that's an interesting question. To me, a slightly more interesting question is, what are the key technologies? So it's not just, the number of new inventions that a particular society has, but what are the key ones that once somebody invents it once, it spreads everywhere, like everybody needs it. Iron plows that improve agricultural productivity is one of these things. Like it gets invented a couple different places across Eurasia, but then eventually spreads really everywhere around the world. Like it seems to be one of the things, in the pre-industrial world that you just need to have in order to function. Cavalry warfare is another one of these things that seems to be, once it comes, it gives you such an advantage that everybody else either has to follow suit and invent it themselves or adapt it, or they just get trampled, and then the society with it sort of takes over that territory. So one way or another, eventually everybody sort of gets it, and that to me is really the interesting questions.
Mm-hmm. When it comes particularly to understanding the rise and fall of societies, do we already know the factors that play a role there? Because, different people present different explanations to why certain societies rise and fall. For example, even Jared Diamond has an entire book, Collapse, on the reasons why certain societies across history have collapsed. So do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, this is still, we don't have the final word on this, I would say, but this is very much something we're interested in. And we are, developing some insights, we're developing some things, and it seems to be, my perspective is that there's sort of two different camps of these sort of theories. As you've talked about, a lot of them are based on sort of external factors and how, again, competition between states or sort of ecological conditions in that sort of diamond model drive states to sort of grow and then fall apart. On the other hand, you have a whole suite of theories that are about the internal conditions. So it's about, is the society, are the institutions sort of inclusive? Are they managing inequalities? Is the economy sort of producing enough goods for people and distributing it? And that is sort of why states grow and fall apart. And both of them have a little bit to say. I mean, there's decent evidence for both of them, but what we try to do, and I think the beauty of our approach, is we say, okay, well, yeah, maybe all these different theories are telling a little bit of the story. How can we actually fit this together into a single kind of mechanistic framework that incorporates both the external pressures and the internal pressures? This is something, my colleague Jim Bennett is actually developing mechanistic models to try to combine these two forces and see how it works. And there seems to be a lot there. It's on the one hand, as we talked about, the external pressure that drives the development of technologies, the development of these institutions, these sort of growing scales. But then, either that, you're going to face an enemy that just conquers you, they're just like that much superior to you, or you're going to kind of get so big that your societal structures are kind of put to the test. You're facing a lot of pressure. There's just, there's too many people fighting for a sort of inelastic supply of positions or resources. Impoverishment happens, elite overproduction happens. There's just literally too many people vying for prestige positions, and they start fighting. And that, can fracture a society that splits it apart. And so a lot of the declines in social complexity, a lot of these, falls of great societies like Rome, like Han China, like, the different Islamic caliphates, a lot of that can actually be pointed to sort of these internal structural demographic factors, as we call it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you reference the way that sometimes by elite people start warring between them. That's one of the reasons why some societies collapse, or at least, I mean, there starts being some internal problems there, and then eventually the society collapses, I guess. So because there are people, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Peter Turchin is one of them, that point toward the fact that when revolutions occur, for example, they are fueled by this sort of dynamics, that there are too many elite people and they start competing against one another, and it's them who basically mobilize the rest of the population toward these kinds of revolutions, and they are not something that happens from the bottom up, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of both. And so, Jack Goldstone in particular really sort of developed this theory, and Peter Turchin, as you say, Andrei Korotayev, some other people really took it. And this is, my work with Peter Turchin right now is very much focused on exploring these dynamics that you're talking about and sort of the implications. And it's a little bit of both. I mean, to me, one of the sort of central forces that we seem to see is, after a society kind of grows, it has this kind of expansion phase. It can only get so big, yet it still is producing people, right? Populations tends to grow. There are more people, inequalities get reified and institutionalized. And what this happens is that kind of inequality is really the kernel that drives a lot of it. And it happens on both ends of it. So it's not only that, a larger number of people, the greater share of the population is becoming impoverished. They don't have as many resources. They're kind of struggling to survive. And they are, fomenting change, and rightly so, right? They're not benefiting from the system. They're looking for change. They're sort of agitating. And there is a lot of bottom-up momentum. There's a lot of bottom-up revolutions. You can see, revolts take place, rebellions take place that are entirely driven by the sort of impoverished majority. But I think, one of Goldstone's main insights was that, yeah, that can happen all the time, but it's not going to be a real overturn of the system. It's not going to have a complete institutional or systemic change if only it's sort of the majority of the population who are involved. If the elites and those who have sort of wealth and power within society, if they remain united, if they remain dead set to maintain the system, there's really nothing you can do about it. So what happens is that eventually this inequality not only impoverishes the majority of the population, but as you're talking about, and as we've seen, time and again historically, and even today, those who sort of are compiling this wealth, those who are kind of benefiting from all this inequality, they're also experiencing this intense competition. Their numbers are growing. There's a larger number of people who, are just below the, you maybe not the 1% wealthiest, you're the 2%, but you want to be in the 1%, and you're pissed off that you're not, and you agitate a lot of competition. Generally, with wealth, you want to translate that into prestige positions. You want to be a senator, you want to be a leader, whatever. And there's usually a finite number of those. And so the more people who sort of have the wealth and think they deserve one of these positions, the fiercer the competition gets over who's going to actually hold these positions. And that is when you see the elite groups themselves start to splinter in faction. And once they're no longer united, then all of this sort of unrest and all of the sort of rebellious intentions of the sort of impoverished majority population, now, as you say, now they can be mobilized by the different elite factions. And that's really when you start to see civil war. That's when you start to see real kind of collapse and splitting of societies. Sometimes it's, sometimes it's very violent, sometimes it's slightly less violent, sometimes it's, what we would call positive institutional change, sometimes it's just a terrible, disaster and huge loss of life. We're actually involved right now. I'm sort of leading a research project funded by the Rasmussen Foundation that's trying to exactly explore this, periods in history where societies have experienced this kinds of tension, these kinds of ruptures, trying to document, okay, what exactly happens? What are the factors that lead from, the very violent, the very devastating outcomes like a major bloody civil war, to the ones where, okay, yeah, there's maybe some fighting, there's maybe some unrest, but the violence is minimal, and it really is resolved more by peaceable institutional reform. How can you actually, what kind of lessons can you learn about what tips the scales either way? And that's really interesting work that we're ongoing right now.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to when societies get bigger and we have, for example, societies on the scale of empires, like we had the Roman Empire, the Macedonian Empire, the Mongol Empire, and others, do we know anything more specific as to why those societies don't seem to last very long when they get that big? Why do they start to fractionalize, for example?
Yeah, well, that's really one of the interesting things that we find is that, it's the size of your society doesn't really seem to matter. And that the same exact processes that are, driving the splintering of a giant empire like Rome or like the various khanates in medieval Central Eurasia, the same exact factors are also splintering, small-scale societies in Hawaii, pre-contact Hawaii, or Indonesia in the late antiquity. So it doesn't really matter how big your society is. It's not like empires are faced with, they have slightly different challenges, but really the dynamics are very similar. And really what matters is, however big you're going to get, there's going to be limits, right? Even the largest khanate only got so big for so long. It doesn't really matter, what that size is. Once you reach your limit, whether it's because of technology, whether it's just because of the terrain, or just because your advance is thwarted by some other society, whatever it happens to be, eventually you're going to face these kinds of pressures. Eventually, there's going to be competition from the outside that, if you can't match it, then you're doomed. You're going to get conquered. Or there's going to be internal rebellion. And a lot of these large empires, like the Alexander's Macedonian Empire, like some of these khanates, they were really a sort of thin veneer of imperial sort of uniformity or imperial control over what were sort of really intense regional conflicts between these sort of elite groups. And again, it's the same kind of dynamics. It's these elites who are, they want to be in charge, they want to institutionalize their own privileges, their own power. And so very quickly, we see that, that kind of competition between these different regional rulers, these regional provincial governors, or whatever it happens to be, drives these wedges in these large societies. Same exact thing that happens even in the small scale societies. And that's, again, one of these really interesting commonalities is that it's not that different, no matter whether you're a tiny, society of a few thousand people, or you're a giant territory of, thousands of kilometers of territory.
Perhaps this is too simplistic, but does it make sense that perhaps as societies grow larger, it's also harder to have control over all that's happening there? And I mean, for example, if you're trying to have centralized government, then I mean, as societies grow larger and as they become empires, for example, I mean, there are many things happening there that perhaps are harder and harder to control. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And it's a really interesting point. There are, you think of sort of Joseph Tainter and the kind of imperial overshoot type theories. There's a lot of work that suggests that those are, it's simply if you get too big, you can't manage it. It's something we're exploring. Again, my colleague Jim Bennett and I have been looking into this a lot, Peter Turchin as well. That doesn't seem to be as supported empirically. There's a few cases where you can kind of point to, it looks like that's what's going on. But again, if you take a very large view, it doesn't seem like that's the main driving factor. And the reason I say that is because you don't actually see the sort of longevity of societies doesn't seem to depend on their size or scale. And so it's not that, the larger you get, the more likely you are to collapse quicker. That's not the case. I mean, it seems like it might be, but it's actually not. If you really sort of look at the durations, if you look at the size of different societies across the globe in different time periods. And again, what seems to be the answer is that, one way or another, societies tend to solve these sort of problems, and it depends on the technology available, and not just the material technology like communications technology or economic sort of institutions, but also what I would call the cultural technology. And so, as we've talked about, the kinds of governing institutions, the kinds of cultural systems that hold groups together, humans find solutions, right? They find slightly different, as we talked about, in the sort of Bronze Age, you had societies that were, a few thousand people, not that large territories, and they found particular solutions in the technology and the ruling systems and the cultural packages to keep that together. And at that time, with those kinds of technologies, you couldn't support a larger scale empire. But eventually, again, through the kind of cultural evolutionary forces that we're talking about, those technological and sort of cultural ruling packages, those evolve as well. And they keep evolving to match and to keep pace with the increasing scale that we see among societies. And so societies kept getting bigger. They got more people. Now we get cities that have 1 million people. Rome in the early empire had 1 million people. That's a huge sort of step in the sort of evolution of scale. Then you see that happen in places in Turkey, in places in China. You see large empires with 60, 70, 100 million people. And by the time that happens, the cultural packages that allow that society to kind of function and cohere also had evolved. And so, we do see societies that big. We do see empires that are that large. We today have societies that are 1 billion people that are able to maintain. So there's no, absolute thresholds of, how big can you get before you fall. A little bit has to do with your suite of technologies, your suite of sort of institutions and norms that hold it together. But, there's nothing about scale itself that leads you to collapse. It's really, how are you managing that scale? And humans seem to always find solutions to do that, no matter how big it gets.
Yeah, so just to put another hypothesis forward, could it have something to do with the fact that perhaps it's hard to try to have people from different cultures, in the case of empires, because we are conquering people from different places that probably
Yeah.
have different customs and so on, to try to have them integrated within the same political unit and try to have them cooperate with one another. I mean, of course, that would get us into issues surrounding multiculturalism and things like that, but I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. Again, I would say that, what matters is sort of the dynamics of it. There's no simple single answer of, oh yeah, multicultural diverse populations are more stable or less stable. They're both. And this is why it is really important to have this sort of large scale dynamic viewpoint. Generally, what we see is that, again, this still requires more research, but I'd say, preliminarily exploring some of these empirical evidence, some of these cases, while societies are expanding, whether it's the Roman Empire, which was very diverse and multicultural, whether it's the Islamic caliphates, which were sort of known, especially the early medieval caliphates, were kind of famous historically for being pluralistic, for being kind of open to diversity and managing it. While you're in that sort of growth phase, and while your institutions are holding, before you start to see these kind of structural demographic pressures, this kind of diversity and multiculturalism is often a boom, right? It really aids you. It brings a diversity of voices, having different people with different cultural backgrounds, different sort of social and technological backgrounds, helps you to adapt more quickly to whether it's a new technology or whether it's a new kind of religious system that is needed to keep everything running smoothly. That kind of diversity is actually turns out to be super helpful, and you sort of need it in these growing phases. However,
can I just interrupt you there for a second? And perhaps having more people from different backgrounds can also aid innovation, right?
Exactly, and this is one of the things that we see in our work exploring the evolution of technology is that the total number of people involved, just the number of potential inventors, seems to actually be one of the factors that is needed. You just need a large population in order to have enough brains working on problems to come up with solutions. You're absolutely right, and it's not just the number of people, but the more, if everyone's all thinking the same, they're going to come up with the same solutions to the same problems. You need diversity. I mean, evolutionarily, evolution doesn't happen without variation. You need diversity. You need people with different backgrounds and different experiences to come up with new solutions to present problems. Again, and what happens, what you see, and the reason that, people can point to these sort of, the challenges of diversity and multiculturalism is that once the society gets to that sort of saturation point, once you start to see these demographic structural pressures happen, once there's impoverishment, once inequality has really been institutionalized, once these fractions start to happen, then unfortunately people can sort of refer back to different aspects of their identity. So, I no longer think of myself as Roman while things are going bad. Now I think of myself as a Gaul, or I think of myself as Spanish, or I think of myself as Tunisian, or whatever it happens to be, or I think of myself as Christian or Muslim, as opposed to having my identity, my central identity, be the overarching political system. But that only really shows up when things are already going bad structurally. But then when that happens, then it's you have these kind of standing animosities, these standing intergroup conflicts that are kind of ready to bubble up and ready to propel societies into these kind of bloody civil wars that we've been talking about. And so that's the challenge that happens, and that's the challenge that a lot of countries today are facing, exactly these same sort of pressures.
Yeah, I'm trying to leave politics aside here, but because nowadays, with the rise of the extreme right particularly, we hear all the time this sort of political narrative that more homogeneous societies are more cohesive and they last longer and things like that. So, I mean, it's not particularly a scientific statement, of course, but just to address it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a scientific statement, and it's empirically false. So that's, again, I agree. I don't want to get sort of political, but that's not that kind of simple of a solution is just empirically not true. But again, it's important not to overlook that, yeah, diversity and having multiple different types of identity systems and sort of focus loci of identity within a particular society is both a advantage and a challenge. And I think that's why it's so tough, and that's why you have somewhat compelling arguments on both sides, is because there are some things you can point to, and that really the issue is, to me, the question is always, okay, it's both. It's an advantage and it's a challenge. How can we develop systems? How can we sort of develop communication strategies that maximize the advantages and minimize the challenges? It's not, one or the other. It's trying to get that sort of unbalanced system, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. And we will come back to this point later in the interview, but let me now ask you about religion specifically, because I mean, religion is one of those big topics in history, and different people have different ideas about it. And if you listen to the new atheists, they look back in history and say that religion was simply a pernicious phenomenon and still is in society. But then again, I've been talking, for example, on the show with cognitive scientists of religion, and they point toward many different societal and individual benefits religion brings. So what would be your take on it?
Well, I mean, this is, again, one of these tough, you're putting me on the test here. I do work with a lot, you've had really excellent interviews with a lot of these cognitive psychologists and sort of cognitive evolutionary scholars. And again, I work with a lot of them. I'm definitely on that side. And to me, I mean, first of all, the academic question, the scholarly question isn't, is religion good or bad? It's why does it arise? And why is it what we call a cultural universal? Like, there's really no society historically that you can point to that has no religion or ritual system at all. Like, this seems to be something that is necessary for societies of any kind of scale to function. And so, from a cultural evolution standpoint, the question really is why, and this is why you point to the advantages, and this is where people like Harvey Whitehouse, Quentin Atkinson, David Sloan Wilson, sort of others that you've talked to, really point out some really compelling arguments about, again, that sort of evolutionary framework of humans need something to a sort of key, a kind of cornerstone that we can identify with, that we can identify others as being one of us, as being part of that in-group, that seems to be essential to solving collective action problems, which are, one of the main things that face humans as a species. And religion just happens to be really good at establishing that kind of group identity and therefore solving collective action problems. So, I mean, that's the best explanation for why it happens and why religions persist. And then you can, get into the details of different kinds of religions and why they develop at different types of scale. And this is some of the work that we do. On the other hand, again, just because there is an advantage, just because there's a clear evolutionary incentive to have these types of systems, doesn't mean that they don't come with some nasty side effects. And, as we talked about, some of the nasty side effects are, collective action and cooperation are great. Societies need to cooperate. The problem is that cooperation is often against others. And so, your in-group is doing great, you're all working together. But if that cooperation is harnessed to work together in order to kill some other group, that's not so great. And, as good as religion is at fomenting that cooperation, it's equally good at reifying and sort of highlighting the differences between different identity groups, and that can lead to these sorts of conflicts. Evolutionarily, that is very useful, but again, if that's something you're trying to minimize, then that becomes a challenge. And really, the question is, as we talked about, how can you maximize the good? How can you get the positive benefits of these kinds of cultural systems in terms of establishing identity, in terms of solving collective action problems, while minimizing that kind of intergroup conflict? And There are advantages, Sergei Gavrilets is another a colleague of mine, and others, Peter Peregrine, have looked about, natural sort of ecological conflicts, like ecological disasters, can be a much more healthy source of competition. So in other words, instead of, human groups cooperating in order to conquer or in order to fight another human group, they cooperate in order to overcome some ecological disaster, whether it's a volcanic eruption or a drought or a famine or a pandemic, that has a similar kind of force of bringing people together without the sort of violence against other humans on the other end. And so, again, more work needs to be done on this, but to me, that's a kind of promising avenue for harnessing the good of religions and these kind of cultural systems while minimizing or mitigating some of the bad that comes with it.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you frame the questions in terms of why do religions have these positive and negative aspects and how do they work and so on, because I wanted to ask you, so this work you're doing with SESHAT and your collaborators, it's not prescriptive in any way. If we get to know how societies work and the sorts of forces that operate on them and that lead them in a direction or another, you're not saying that that's particularly good or bad, right?
Yeah, I think that's extremely well put. We really try to avoid being prescriptive, to avoid favoring any particular theory or any particular viewpoint. Really the point of SESHAT and why we brought sort of work on it is to bring together as much empirical evidence as possible in order to test theories. And we want to bring the scientific method to bear on historical questions. This is really what we call the cliodynamics approach, which is kind of the methodological driver of what we do. And you're exactly right. We want to gather all of the different theories that have been proposed. They're all up for grabs. They all tend to have something speaking for them. They have something that seems appealing about these theories, but they can't all be right, or they can't at least all be entirely right. And so this is what we try to do. We are neutral. We don't have a favorite. Okay, this theory makes this prediction. This other theory makes that prediction. Let's look at the historical record. Let's look at the empirical data. And, this is why it's important to have this kind of quantitative approach as well. To say, okay, well, let's actually count things up. Let's measure it. Which one is more right? Or is it a third option that actually explains all the data better? And, not prescriptive, really just, as you say, descriptive of how can we explain the patterns that we in fact have observed?
Mm-hmm. So in the book, just to talk about, just to be more specific now, in the book you present many different numbers and, for example, regarding standing armies, monuments, collective rituals. So by looking at these numbers, can we say something in terms of the social dynamics that we find in a particular society? So, for example, if we have a bigger army, does that by itself tell us anything about how the society is organized, for example?
It's an interesting question. The book, The Figuring Out the Past, is, again, it's not so academic. It's really for general audience. It's really just to, one of the main reasons we wrote it was just to show that there's so much diversity, there's so much similarity, there's so much interesting things happening in places of the world, in different societies that most people haven't heard of. Whether it's the highlands of Papua New Guinea, or whether it's sort of northern Colombia, whether it's the Niger River Delta in Mali, whatever it happens to be, just sort of collecting this sort of information. On the other hand, you raise an interesting point, and I would say it's not so much that you can go from the size of the standing armies or how large your monument was. You're not going to have just from those numbers alone a perfect sense of what the society was like. But once you start adding up these numbers, once you start counting the different aspects, these different sort of statistics, when you have the framework, then it is very it is revealing of what the society is like. And again, we talk about the challenges that all these societies face and how they are adapting different technologies, different cultural systems in order to meet these challenges of intergroup competition or whatever it happens to be. This is why you actually see these numbers change, and the numbers are very diagnostic of the solutions to these challenges. Armies tend to grow as you are facing this, as you're scaling up, as you're growing in order to face the particularly intense competitions. But they also then fall, right? And that's one of the interesting things that we want to highlight, and one of the things that the book tries to do. I think a lot of people sort of generally have the sense that things in history just always get bigger and better. They start really small and sort of undeveloped or primitive, and then they sort of get more advanced over time. Maybe in a very general sense, that's kind of true, but it's not as true as people think, and things tend to be non-monotonic. There's really important drops. There's important differences in the dynamics. And so, yeah, standing armies tend to grow with competition, but they don't only grow. They also go down as a society wins out, as these large empires basically conquer the competitive field. They don't need as large standing armies anymore. You actually see competition, you see conflict minimize. Again, as societies are growing, they are starting to institutionalize hierarchies, institutionalize, status differentials, and those lead to bigger and better and more impressive monuments. And so, yeah, looking at, the size of pyramids, the size of palaces in northern China, or the lack of palaces in Western Africa is, it's not going to give you the entire picture, but it is definitely diagnostic of part of the story of, how that society was evolving in that particular time. Sure.
But it's by looking at all of those numbers together, right? And that's perhaps the reason why for different societies, different empires and so on, you present numbers from many different kinds of sources and institutions and cultural tools and so on.
Exactly, yeah. That's as we talked about, it's these different things, the material technology, the cultural institutions, the norms, are not actually that different. They're all responding to the same underlying dynamics, and you're absolutely right. Looking at the numbers all together, as long as you have a kind of framework for understanding, the evolution of societal structures and those sorts of dynamics, then yeah, you can sort of see how the numbers together, are epiphenomenal or revelatory of what's going on underneath.
Mm-hmm. And so to talk about specifically cultural tools, like for example in the book you mentioned bureaucracy, law codes, calendars, do they tell us anything about the kinds of tools that societies need when they start getting larger scale to function properly and to be able to grow more and to get more complex? I mean, is there, for example, a minimum set of tools that they need?
That's really interesting. We kind of, again, I don't like need. It's not like an absolute requirement, but in our work and sort of some of our recent publications, we've shown that, yeah, there are very, very strong common patterns, and it's not a minimum. And again, it's not a single minimum threshold or a single package that you need, but as societies scale up, as they evolve, then yes, there's more and more pressure. It becomes more and more likely that they're going to adapt different governing systems, different information exchange systems, which is what calendars are, which is what sort of writing systems are, really an information exchange system. Yeah, you can get pretty large, pretty complex societies without writing, without those kinds of information packages, but we've never seen any that are really, really large without it, right? It does seem to be at some threshold eventually, yeah, you do need a way to translate information that's not just verbal. And other sort of things, yeah.
Yeah, so a more general question now. I've already asked you about human universals. With this data, can we, because of the similarities we find across societies, can we tell anything about human nature? And I mean, do you understand the kind of question I'm trying to ask you here?
I do. I mean, it's a very tough question. I do understand it. It's a good question. Yeah, again, human nature, it's a term I would sort of shy away from just because it is very loaded. and it implies a lack of diversity. And again, as we talked about earlier, to me, you can understand commonalities. You can understand, yes, there are common challenges that all human societies face. There's a limited set of answers to those challenges. And so that looks like something like universal, that looks like a sort of law of human societies, that we need to respond to these challenges in particular ways. And there is something to that. But at the same time, that doesn't preclude the fact that, the specific manifestations of how these challenges, how these religions, how these governing institutions are put together allows for a huge range of diversity. And so human societies at the same time are all exactly the same and each entirely different. And that's tricky, and that's a little bit of an unfair answer, but honestly, I do think that it is both. Both of those things happen at the same time, and that's conceptually how we sort of need to reframe our thinking around this.
Mm-hmm. So I have a couple final questions just before we go. We've been talking about mostly historical events, but with your data, can it help us understand contemporary events?
Yeah, I mean, this is the million-dollar question. And as I talked about, the project that I'm currently sort of leading and focused on is exactly this, is trying to, catalog cases from history about, what happens, what are the pressures that societies face, how do they respond to them, whether it's, responding poorly and leading to collapse, or how do they respond well. And, not the first goal is just to understand what happened in the past. But as you say, the sort of longer term goal and the subsidiary idea here is that we can learn lessons. Understanding what happened in societies that are facing particular challenges can help us understand how we are responding and why societies today are responding to very similar sort of challenges. And, this can also maybe give hints to what's going to happen down the road, or how can we maybe shift the scales of what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was the other question I was going to ask you. Can we make any predictions about the future?
Yeah, I knew you were getting to this. And this is, again, it's really, really an important question. And a lot of historians shy away from it. And it is very fraught. Academia doesn't have a great history with being prescriptive about kind of societal things. Which again, we want to be very wary of that. However, I don't, and my colleagues and I don't shy away from this. And I would say that prediction is not something we do. Prediction implies a level of certainty or a level of specificity that we don't have. We talk about it more in terms of forecasting, and we liken this to kind of weather forecasting, right? Really what meteorologists look at is they look at, atmospheric pressures and how these pressures build up. And they say, okay, as these pressures are building, it becomes more and more likely that there's going to be a storm. You can't say the exact time, you can't say the exact, block in the city where it's going to happen. You don't know exactly how long the storm's going to last. But you can say, okay, chances are getting increasingly likely that if you go outside, you're going to need an umbrella. That's more like what we do, right? We can, understanding these dynamics, understanding these structures and how they've played out in history, we've proven, and sort of Peter Turchin has done a lot of work sort of showing that this can also allow us to track how these pressures are building up in contemporary societies and allow us not to predict, but to forecast. We don't know exactly what day there's going to be an armed revolt. We don't know exactly, who's going to be the leader of a sort of rebellious movement. But we can track, okay, pressures are building. It's becoming increasingly likely that there's going to be some kind of societal storm, as we would put it. There's, you're going to need an umbrella. And one of the long-term goals of my sort of Rasmussen Foundation funded project is to be able to, understand the factors that lead, when these pressures build up, what determines, okay, they keep building until they, release in this major catastrophic, bloody, violent civil war, or what, actually allows these pressures to dissipate with relatively little violence, with actually positive reform that actually increases the well-being of people down the road. What can we learn from history that can allow us to maybe come up with some ideas of how we can tip the scales of modern societies that are facing these pressures to help move them away from sort of the catastrophic outcomes towards the more beneficial ones. And again, not being overly prescriptive, but not shying away from the fact that history does provide us some lessons in this. And the other thing that I would say is, when we talk about forecasting, one of the other ways that it's different from prediction is we want to be wrong. Like the entire point of doing these forecasts is to say, there's trouble ahead. This is the warning sign. Pressures are building. A storm is brewing. The whole point of highlighting that and bringing that out into the open is so that people can change course, and so that people can intervene so that the forecasted trouble doesn't actually happen. And so, we want more than anything to be wrong. And that's really, one of the I think goals and one of the important roles that historians can play is uncovering these patterns, uncovering these lessons that can help us avoid some of our past mistakes.
Mm-hmm. So even if it isn't overly prescriptive, I mean, the kind of approach you have here, it can be perhaps in the future utilized by people to try to bring about better, more prosperous societies, and perhaps have some sort of be put to political ends.
Yeah, and this is, again, it's not for people like me, it's not for academics or historians to say, oh, here's exactly the law you need to put in place, or here's the response. But, again, we talk about some of these internal pressures. We talk about elite overproduction, for example, as one of these driving forces. We can identify in many parts of the world, in the US and in the UK and Canada, where I'm based today, these forces are clearly happening. And so, yeah, we're not going to say, here's exactly the law that you need to resolve this, but we can point out that, wealth inequality is one of these major things. Having fairly closed sort of prestige political offices is one of these factors that intensifies this kind of competition. So that suggests to policymakers, different kinds of reforms that can have a more equitable redistribution of wealth within a society, or, tweaks to the political system that allows sort of de-escalates the competition for the top political prestige positions. Things like that are absolutely available. And, we have started to, and we want to do more of interaction and conversations with real policymakers and really narrow that divide between sort of the academic world and the policy putting things into practice sort of world, which is, again, dangerous. It's fraught, but, I don't think it's safe to shy away from it completely. We need these lessons that history can offer.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the book is again figuring out the past, that 3,495 vital statistics to explain world history. Where can people find your work on the internet?
They can find it everywhere. You can go to Amazon, you can go to Profile Publishers, you can go to Hachette Press to find this work. You can look up sort of my name, Daniel Hoyer. You can look up peterturchin.com. Go to the SESHAT databank.info, which is where you can find everything you need to know about our project and our work. So,
by the way, are you thinking about writing a more academic book in the future? Trying to explain how we should think about or how to make sense of these statistics?
Yeah, so we have actually a few, academic books, but also aimed at a kind of a more general audience, actually in the work, that are exactly trying to bring together a lot of the strands that we were talking about today. So this is, a couple years down the road, but this is definitely coming. So that's a good question.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I hope to have you on the show again when those books are out. And thank you for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, great conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. So it is thanks to people like you that the show has been running for such a long time, more than 3 years now. And I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, hit the subscription button, and comment on it. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henry Calenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Bosch, Bo Weingart, Becker Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Ala Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.